Hello, you are listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer and Amazon #1 bestselling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Our guest today is Chris Duffy Wentzel. Chris Duffy Wentzel is the author of a new book. It's a healing memoir. It's called Finding the Missing Piece, A Healing Journey to Wholeness. Chris Duffy Wentzel is a personal development coach, and you can find out more about Chris Duffy Wentzel and her wonderful work at kachinawoman.com. Welcome, Chris Duffy Wentzel.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and hi to all of the listeners.
Now, Chris Duffy Wentzel, you recently faced a life-threatening illness and used this as an opportunity to find your birth parents. In the United States, an estimated 135,000 children are adopted every year. In the UK, the number of children adopted every year is fallen and has fallen by about 1/3 since 2015. So many people who were adopted go through so many feelings that may affect them their whole life. You are a personal development coach. What advice would you give another person? Because you've written a book about peace, inner peace. What advice would you give another person who's been adopted to come to peace with the knowledge that they've been adopted?
Yes, great question. Thank you. Well, for me, I was told I was adopted at the age of 3. I was told that I was very special and other people get the child that they get, and I was so special, I'm the one they chose. And honestly, for a lot of my childhood, that worked out fine for me, except when that idea of being special as I got older turned into an acute desire to be perfect. And honestly, Catherine, I did not realize, and this is hard to believe because, you'd think you'd live with it, you'd get it sooner. Not until I wrote my book did I get in touch with this voice inside my head that said, well, if they picked you, they can send you back. I know. I was in tears when it channeled through it, and I thought, this was the drive behind this incredible perfectionism. If I got a 90 on a test, it wasn't good enough. And it actually ended up impacting my relationship with my adopted mom, because I then deflected everything on her, that she was the problem. She was the one that demanded so much. So I spent a lot of years not only striving to be the best of the best, but also trying to separate from her. I'd come home with awards from work and she would say, "You're just like me." And that would send me off into a tailspin. I'm like, I am nothing like you. So I had emotions that I ended up burying as with an eating disorder. And even that took years. I was in my 30s when I finally found a book, which is the reason why I actually wrote a book. This book that I found was called Feeding the Hungry Heart by Janine Roth. Changed my life. I had no idea that the incredible behaviors that I was exhibiting was really just all about keeping the emotions in check, because I didn't think I was strong enough to feel them. And her book started to put it all together. And that was really, another 10 years of moving through with the help of therapists and everything, because I had no knowledge of mind body healing, back then, none. I was a corporate woman working a very fast track and a large team and a big responsibility. And I, was a workaholic, perfectionist. And so my advice to people is seek help sooner, understand the emotional impact that we're going to experience. And when I work with people that are adopted, the themes are so common. I mean, we all share fear of abandonment, security and stability are incredibly important, and it exhibits in very interesting ways. The desire to be loved and accepted, right? All of those things come into play.
Now, certainly all of us have issues with our parents, those who were adopted and those who weren't.
Yes.
You are a personal coach. What are some of the common challenges of people who knew they were adopted as children? And what are some of the good ways to address these challenges?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the number one best way is it's always about open and honest communication and setting up that environment as the adoptive parents to make sure that there's not these hidden feelings that eventually really manifest into something that is really unhealthy. And what I find in working with a lot of folks, and it certainly true in my journey, I knew how hard my adoptive parents worked to get me, the money that it cost, the toll that it took. I mean, there's a story in and of itself of what happened. So the last thing I wanted to do was hurt their feelings, which is another part of, the stuffing down the emotions, because here are these people that, in my case, my life would have been very different after I kind of cracked the adoption puzzle and found out what my life would have been like, would have been extremely different. So I lived with a lot of gratitude, at the same time, resentment. So I think that if my adoptive parents had known all of the emotions that they could, expect from their adopted child and had a vehicle to talk about it, that would have saved me a lot of time. And in the folks that I've worked with, there's a really big difference when they come from an environment where that is an open, honest conversation. My entire adoptive family died before I started the search, because I knew I couldn't really finally crack this code with them alive. I didn't think I could keep it from them because I'd want to tell them, but at the same time, I felt like they would feel like, well, we weren't enough. Like, why did you have to do this? How were we not enough for you?
Now, how can adoptive parents best support the children they adopted so that the children that they've adopted know that they are unconditionally loved and accepted?
Oh boy, that's $1 million question, because I think every parent, right, I think struggles with how to do that and ensure that they're loved. And I do think it's the families that I've experienced where it's called an open adoption, it's a very different experience, right? When the child knows, what at some point they have access to the information about their birth family, that is where you see much more adjustment in terms of the child, as they get older. And it's really why you see a lot being written right now about adoption, as potentially having its Me Too movement, because there's these sealed, closed records. While understandable, right? We know why that happened. Back in the 50s when I was adopted, they felt that if it wasn't a closed, sealed file, the birth mothers would never, give up their children. So, and you contrast that to so many systems now where they do have information. I have a good friend, and her son found her when he was 30, but the birth mother and the adoptive mother had been in communication. They had shared information. And so the adoptee was in control of when they wanted to seek, more information. So I really think legislatively and as a society, I think we really need to look at those rules and laws and the whys. And I would my advice to the parents is to be as open and transparent as humanly possible. And, I didn't come up from a family like that. You didn't talk about feelings, right? So I think that kind of environment would make a huge amount of difference.
Now, you mentioned that fear of abandonment was a common emotion among people who've been adopted. And yet we can all have fear of abandonment for many reasons.
Right.
As a personal coach, how do you think, what are some good ways to overcome fear of abandonment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that it really starts with awareness. Everything starts with awareness and really getting in touch with the inner voice that we have that's running constantly in the background that we don't even know is there, right? And, for me, it took a lot of years before I was strong enough to find mindfulness practices, like yoga and meditation. And then once that happened and I started to stop being a human doing and, started being, then I was flooded with all of the fears and the scary thoughts that I had kept at bay, right? So being able to then sit with those feelings and realize that they're not going to destroy you is, I think, number one, because when you don't know they're even there, you have no way of working through that issue, right? And then what I really have recognized in myself and with others that I'm working with is befriending that inner critic, right? So how do we work together to realize that these things that happened, when I was, 5 and 10 and 15 and, however old, and things that would get triggered in a corporate setting, all of a sudden I wasn't, I didn't get a promotion. And fears kick in that maybe, I'm going to be abandoned from this opportunity. So I think that as you start to know more about what's happening and work together, you can actually start to heal those really deep emotional wounds. And at the end of the day, what I've seen to be the most effective is the realization that no one but you can accept you, right? It is a never-ending search to find acceptance and approval and security. And I think at the end of that whole journey, when I think about how long I searched and what happened at the end, coming back to the realization that I was the one that had the solutions, right? I'm the one that really is going to, give myself the acceptance. And I see that in I coach, I would say mostly women, Catherine. And it's just the most incredible thing to see that aha, when they realize they're not victims, when you find that the awareness and understand what's been going on behind the scenes and recognize that you have the skills and you can find the skills and the people that can help you, you no longer are a victim and now you become empowered. And so issues like abandonment, they no longer rule, they fall away.
Wonderful insight. And, this is sort of a good time to, I'm going to share this with our audience because we're talking about adoption and dealing with our feelings of adoption and dealing with our feelings about growing up as children. Mm-hmm. And in my 10th book, Reading the Soul, one of the things that I talk about is that many of us who are born in this body, our birth parents were not actually our soul's first choice. So follow me, if you will. So as a medical intuitive healer, sometimes what I do is I identify how many times you as a soul tried to be born, tried to be incarnated in this body in this lifetime. So for myself, I'll use myself, for example, my soul tried to be born 8 times. Mm-hmm. And I remember I was not adopted. My birth parents were my birth parents. But I remember even as a child looking at them and thinking, who are these people? Why am I with them? Which I think is a very common feeling among children. And so you, as a medical intuitive healer, I can identify how many times your soul tried to be born. And you have to understand that if you tried multiple times to be born, you're actually a very strong soul and you had a very strong purpose for being here. And then your feelings about that process always affect an organ. So in my case, it affected my liver, and it was a little bit frustrated, like, right? So a lot of these themes that Chris Duffy Wentzel, you are bringing such wonderful insight about, they're very common actually to all of us who are born. This feeling of what, fear of abandonment. Am I loved? Do I have to be perfect in order to be loved? So we're going to take a break and listen to one of our commercial sponsors and come right back. So Chris Duffy Wentzel, author of Finding the Missing Piece, A Healing Journey to Wholeness. So you went about looking for your birth parents as part of your healing journey to recover from cancer. If someone listening to this broadcast knows they were adopted, what do you think are some good ways to go about finding your birth parents?
Oh, wow. That is a big question. In so many cases, people have, and it depends on how old they are, right? They have no records. My aha moment was when I was in a genetics class in 8th grade and everybody was going around saying their nationality. And I went, I have no idea. So you know what I did when I got home that night at dinner. And I said, okay, well, I'm not Irish and German. What am I? And all they knew was my mother was a high school student. And that was it. So, of course, the first thing I did was go to the adoption agency. And I had to wait until I was 18 to do that. And they basically give you what they call non-identifying information. And so the best advice I received, there was an article that I had read when I was in my 20s, was keep every little piece of information. It is truly like assembling a puzzle, because you have no idea who's going to give you that one piece of information that's going to help you crack the code. So for me, it was a 3-decade-long search of constantly calling. And what I found is there was one social worker, and she broke the rules. I mean, there are very strict guidelines of what they are supposed to follow. And she was delivering some very troubling news to me, that she had made contact, and they at that point said that she had spoken to a woman speaking on my mother's behalf. And the woman said, we will accept no contact, no letters, no anything. And I had my journal, I had my pen and paper, I was ready. And through my tears, all of a sudden, she starts giving me information that I knew, if I put it all together with what I had been gathering and hired a private detective, I could find her. Well, then, you sit back and you say, okay, at this point, my mother's in her 50s. I know she's married. I know she has children. Now you get into a very ethical dilemma around rights. Whose rights? Now, I have rights as an adoptee to know my medical history. I married a man that had cystic fibrosis in his family. We never had children. And part of the reason was the concern of, the people in his family died. They never made it to 13, 14. So I had a very strong reason of wanting to know my medical background. And that's another piece of the puzzle that I was so stunned when I went to the adoption agency and said, well, what about the medical updates? Don't the birth moms call in? And they looked at me like I was crazy. Like, we're not an adoption or a detective agency. We don't track these women down. So even if there was a system where you could get the medical information, another piece of advice I would say to adoptive parents, if you could somehow get those pieces of information, that would save an incredible amount of angst and pain. And I think the other thing to get back to the question of what to do, be open to using alternative resources. I mean, I'm a clinically trained scientist, right? So I was all about facts and data. So here I have all of these pieces of information. I decided to honor my mother's wishes and not hire a private detective. And I put it away. I locked that door firmly until 2009, when I was diagnosed with uterine cancer. So the surgeon, of course, is saying, no big deal. We're just going to take your uterus and your ovaries and get on with things. At which point, I was a busy career woman and I scheduled the surgery over Christmas, like get it done. And 2 weeks before the surgery on my yoga mat, there was a voice that I opened my eyes. The voice was so loud. And it said, slow down, you have time, check out other options. And that's what propelled me on to the mind-body healing. I had no idea what I was doing. I had to find holistic healers that were willing to work with me, find the way that we could monitor what was happening with imaging technology and do alternative healing. So this whole adoption search, try to find my medical history, then reignited my search for my mother. So after 20-some years of promising I would stop looking for her, then I had to start again. So, and I used mediums, psychics, and intuitives, which I didn't, just sit down and talk to a friend about that. I literally started getting messages in a dream about what to do. And so I guess the long answer is be open to exploring other opportunities and options. And I was on a new pathway. And I know for many of your listeners, you're like, well, of course you listen to your inner guidance system. That's how we, function. In where I was in my life at that time, that was an entirely new concept. And what I started to realize as I followed that journey was I didn't have to work so hard. I didn't have to always be swimming upstream. It was like at some point I could actually drop the oars and just float downstream and not make my life so difficult. So that's another, I think, piece of advice to offer people is, people want to help, follow your inner guidance and be open to things that, if you told me I would be sitting in front of a past life regression therapist and she would help me crack the code, I would have told you were crazy. And it worked though.
Now, if someone knows they were adopted and they're going through this arduous search process, are there any good ways for an adopted person to mentally, emotionally, spiritually prepare for meeting their birth parents?
Yeah, boy. I'm not sure that there's no single bullet on how to prepare. Other than, again, I think being really reaching out to your support community, because you have no idea what you're entering into, right? You could be completely nurtured and supported and it's a reunion, or you could be reigniting a wound in that birth mother that is something that they have buried for 50, 60 years. And I've worked with people that have experienced both parts of that. And it really goes back, honestly, to the self-acceptance. In so many cases, when the pain is so acute, it's because they're just starving for love and acceptance from their birth mother. And then if they don't get it, because they're in so much pain, it's recognizing that it's not about them at that point, right? This is, again, it's going back inside and pulling the internal resources that say, like, I'm here on this planet. I deserve to be here. I plan to be here. This is the path. This is part of my healing. And, I'm going to rely on friends and family and the things I know to help me get through it and not have it destroy your life. I was in tears on some of the adoption posts, adoption support communities a couple of weeks ago, because people will write, I finally met my birth mother and she doesn't want anything to do with me. And it's like they're just reliving all of that pain. And, in my case, I was too late. When I finally cracked the code, my mother was gone. And I had no idea the depth of emotion that I carried in my body until I received word that she was gone. And my cancer was uterine cancer. And believe me, I was not oblivious to the connection. So when you talk about like where does the disease land in your body, I thought it was quite interesting for me that the second chakra is unresolved grief, sadness, and loss. And I've worked with a number of people that have breast cancer or uterine cancer, and I find that interesting in the sense of where the physical is manifesting the emotional wound. So I don't know if you can ever adequately be prepared. Eyes wide open, and make sure you've got a support community, because no matter which way it goes, you're going to want to have help.
Great advice, Chris Duffy Wentzel. Now, in my work as a medical intuitive healer, I find that there's 3 common wounds that are very common among adopted people, but they're very common in pretty much in many of us. The 3 common wounds and healing work that I feel that we could all benefit from receiving. The first one is I'm wanted. And again, this is a common theme among people who are adopted. I'm wanted. But again, it can also be found even among people who had a so-called traditional birth process. Because, and how this shows up even among traditional births is that maybe dad wanted a boy and you ended up being a girl, or mom wanted a girl and you were a boy, right? Or, you were a surprise baby. There's many of us who are surprise babies. We weren't planned. I think that's the reason there's billions of people on the planet, is that if our parents all waited till they had all their ducks in a row and could afford us, then there would be a lot fewer humans. So first wound that I feel like everyone could benefit from, whether you're adopted, especially adopted, but a lot of us, is I'm wanted. The next one is actually I'm good enough. Because many people, I find in my 28 years as a medical intuitive healer, is that frequently people have this underlying core belief that there was something wrong with them that caused the birth parents to turn them over to be adopted, and that the child tends to internalize this and decides there's something wrong with me, rather than there was some other external reason that the birth mother turned you over. So I'm good enough. And again, most of us could benefit from a healing on I'm good enough. Because as you mentioned in your own life, if you don't feel good enough, then you can make straight A's or make X amount of money or achieve all these job titles. And yet deep down, you're never healing that core soul wound. And the last one that I find very common among adopted people, but again, a lot of us could receive this healing and really benefit, is I deserve to be loved just the way that I am.
Yes.
I deserve to be loved just the way that I am. So many of us, because we feel like we're not wanted or we're not good enough, we feel like we've got to change some aspect of ourselves, change my weight, change my size, change my hair color, change, you fill in the blank, because I'm not really lovable. And this causes a tremendous amount of soul level grief. So those are 3 healings that I feel that everybody who's adopted could really benefit from. And yet many of us who are not adopted could also benefit from. So let's take another break for a word from our sponsor. So Chris Duffy Wentzel, author of Finding the Missing Piece. So to hear you're telling the story, you never got to meet your birth mother in person.
Right. Yes.
So, and yet you worked with people who were adopted, who got to meet their birth parents. How do you feel that actually meeting birth parents can heal everybody, because so many people, so many adopted children go through a lot of work and a lot of heartache trying to find their birth parents. How
Yeah.
can that be a healing experience?
Well, so much of what you were just sharing, the I'm wanted, I'm good enough and I deserve to be loved, like all of those core wounds, and they all can get healed with that experience of finding out what were the circumstances, why, did the birth mother have to let the child go, and learning more about their lineage and the patterns and where things came from and starting to put the pieces together is so healing, in and of itself. And I have a dear friend who is in her 60s, and her adult son reached out to her literally the week that my book was published, which we thought was sort of the universe doing some wonderful thing there. And I have pictures of their reunion still on my phone, because you cannot even describe the intensity of the love that is happening between them. And it's that opportunity to feel a connection that, most of us only dream of. And, an interesting piece is, even if you don't get a chance to meet the birth mom or dad because they're passed on, if somebody knows the story, it can be incredibly healing. Like, I had this very strange behavior where I didn't want anybody to celebrate my birthday. I mean, and that started when I was 5. Like, my mom had this big party, all the kids in the neighborhood came. There's pictures of me in tears. And as I got older and started to realize, okay, what is this? I always wondered what she was doing. What was she thinking? Did she think of me? Was this a horrible day? A horrible day for her. It still is real for me. And I wanted to spend that time in a quiet way. And so here's where it just was so magnificent. My mother's husband knew about me. He didn't know about me until about 20 years after they were married, but he could give me the piece of the puzzle, which was, honey, I didn't know what was wrong with your mother. We were at Christmas, all the kids were opening their presents, and I look over at her and she's got this distant look in her face and she's just about in tears. And she never told him. It took her 20 years to finally tell him. And it had effects on their marriage, because he's like, he could see this big wall that she wasn't willing to let down. And she finally told him when her parents died, which was interesting because it was a secret that only her mother knew about, which was crazy. But I think it's really, at the end of the day, what struck me as I was sharing my story online and working with people online, the secrets are what really hold this whole thing in a grip that is, once you can start to open that up, because the healing that I personally received and I've seen from others, when you hear the story, the threads, it's amazing how the story that we've told ourselves about not being good enough or not wanted, it just falls away. It truly does.
Very powerful. I have to share this story with our audience. So years ago, I don't even remember how long, maybe 20 years ago, I was sitting at a large convention in the audience, and a woman next to me said, who I'd never met before, she said, I have no idea who you are or what you do, but I know you're here to help me. And I said, okay. So anyway, she and I had a session, and through my work as a medical intuitive healer, I helped her understand why she had been adopted. And in her case, she was a psychotherapist. So she had spent decades, like you did, trying to heal herself. But at a soul level, she didn't really understand why her birth mother did what she did. And on this level, one of the things that I'm always talking about is sometimes if you look at life purely on, that we'll call it reality, Okay. And you don't understand what's happening on the soul level, you miss a big piece of what was going on. So on the reality level, you know, you could have called her birth mother a loser. She was a drug addict. She was unwed. Clearly, she had a very hard life and a lot of heartache. But what had happened was that the soul of my client's soul, as I mentioned, and I talked about in my book, Reading the Soul, my 10th book, had tried multiple times to be born. And the birth mother made a soul agreement with her. It's like, okay, I will let you come through me. I will give birth to you. And when you really look at that, at the soul level, the birth mother, rather than being this so-called loser, was one of the most kind, generous, heart open people. It's like, okay, I'm going to take this broken vessel and give you a life so that you can be born and you can do what you are here to do. And I think in my work as a medical intuitive is that as we understand the deeper meaning behind our stories, behind why we were born and what our parents went through, again, whether, you know, they put us up for adoption or not, we can bring a lot of grace, a lot of forgiveness, a lot of understanding, and a lot of compassion.
That's so true. You know, I really, when I was kind of summing up my journey and thinking about, it really was a soul journey of self-discovery. And there were all these treasures along the way. So I would invite everyone to look at life that way. Like, what are those treasures? What am I learning? And for me, it really was compassion, forgiveness, self-acceptance, and truly loving myself free. And I never had bad feelings towards my mother at all, because I knew she was 17. And what came to me as I was writing, because the book, I'd never had this experience before, Catherine, the book just channeled through. Like, once I sat down, I could not type as fast as the information was coming in. And I could hear a voice that I didn't know. And I came to realize it was my birth mother. And I believe part of the drive, the reason to write it, is my mother never had a voice. These women that have given away their children have no voice. It is a secret of all secrets. And I got chills as the book was coming in, realizing this was an opportunity to give her and women like her a voice. And I started to realize, as I met all the different parts of the family, the aunts and the cousins, and there were all kinds of stories that had been told. And I started to realize I was healing an ancestral line. I was healing so much in connection to my birth family. It certainly wasn't anything that I ever set out to do. In fact, there was a really good part of me that did not want to write this book. About 2 months before it came out, I was in acute fear because I'd spent a career in a corporate space, now thinking everybody's going to know my stuff. And what I realized is how great that everybody knows my stuff, because this is how we're healing each other. When we share our stories, people find pieces of ourselves in each other's stories. And again, I feel like that's part of what the energies as we're moving forward, stopping all the secrecy and having, open and honest conversations, and recognizing that we are parts, I lived a lot of my life in my head. And part of the healing that I went through is realizing I could open my heart, and I became strong enough that I wasn't going to be crushed. Mm-hmm. And I think that it took me a lot of years to figure out that wall that I had created. And I've seen it in so many of the people that I've had the honor of working with. It's when that self-love and acceptance really starts to take hold, you realize how strong you are, right? And that's, to me, is how we help each other, grow on this this incredible journey that we're all on.
So Chris Duffy Wentzel, how do you think resolving your own adoption issues help you heal from cancer?
Yeah, well,
You wrote a whole book about it, right?
I did. Well, and I never had the surgery. So because I really was so boxed into, I needed this information for medical reasons, right? That's the catalyst. And I came to realize the only way I was going to break the promise to my mother that I would not try to find her was I needed something catastrophic that was going to push me. And I believe that she wanted to be found. And, I was diagnosed Labor Day, 2009. I found out she passed 2 weeks later. So all the messages that I was receiving, because they were some very specific messages, when the journey was over, I was like, there is no doubt in my mind that those messages were coming from her, because she really wanted me to be healed. And there was a point, once I found out I was not going to meet her, and I got in touch with the depth of the emotion that I had been carrying in my body my entire life. I was literally driving to my ultrasound appointment in Boston, and I knew as I was driving there that they were not going to find anything. I just knew it. And, we continued to monitor it. But it was as I was able, and I had been working with energy healers and doing, alternative therapies, as I know your audience knows a lot about. So I had been working on releasing for months and months and months. And so, I'm still, I get monitored periodically, but the cancer disappeared. I never had the surgery. And there's no doubt in my mind that that journey was my soul's journey. That was my purpose. And I also believe this chapter in my life that I didn't expect to have, which was writing a book, is all part of that soul journey. Yeah.
Now, how can we heal from the shame of adoption? So many parents who would have given up their child, and many people who are adopted, part of the emotional tapestry is shame. How do you think we can heal from the shame of adoption?
Oh, boy. I am really not sure how to answer that, to be honest with you. For whatever reason, that emotion didn't play for me. And I don't know why, because I've thought about that as I'm a student of Brene Brown's work, on shame. I love everything that she's written. And I remember looking through it and thinking, well, how did I miss that? So I feel a little bit, I'm not sure how to answer that. And even with some of the people that I've worked with, it hasn't played as much as one would think. And I haven't done any work, honestly, with birth mothers in a coaching perspective. I know from certainly my personal birth family now hearing the story, shame was enormous for her. And it manifested physically with acute migraines and some really, eventually, she died from emphysema, which also for me was a broken heart. Like kind of like that whole like struggling to breathe. But I think it all goes back to having open, honest conversations about the situations and recognizing, to your point, we're spiritual beings having a human experience. So what is this truly all about, and having those conversations? So, there's probably so many people that can answer that question better. But that's my sort of narrow scope on that. Yeah.
Thank you. It's my observation as a medical intuitive healer that often when we don't understand something on the so-called reality level, on that which can be quantified and measured and cataloged, when we really have a deeper understanding of what's happening at the soul level and what our soul agreements were. And so, for example, I believe that you had a soul contract with your mother, for sure, and it was mutual. So when we have soul agreements, sometimes it can be your birth mother was here to help you, or you were here to help your birth mother, or you were here to help each other. So I think that, again, when we understand things from a spiritual perspective and from a soul journey perspective, that helps to heal a lot of the shame. So Chris Duffy Wentzel, a wonderful interview, author of Finding the Missing Piece, A Healing Journey to Wholeness. Any final thoughts for our audience?
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. And I would leave everyone with, have the courage to dive in and heal the emotional wounds and ask for help. It took me a lot of years to realize that people want to help, and I didn't have to go on this journey alone. And to follow your joy. I'm working with so many people now that don't even know what brings them joy. Like, we've lost touch with that. So really, starting a joy journal and looking at what are those things in your life. Is it dancing? Is it playing with the cat? Is it watching children? Whatever it is, getting in touch with that, because I think fundamentally we all deserve to be happy. And someone said that to me and innocently at a yoga class, and it started my entire healing journey. So recognizing that we're on an incredible journey and we're loved. And I just offer my story and hope that it has helped somebody out there. And thank you, in peace and in love for everyone.
You've been listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 bestselling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Our guest today has been Chris Duffy Wentzel, author of Finding the Missing Piece, A Healing Journey to Wholeness. And you can find about Chris Duffy Wentzel and her wonderful work at kachinawoman.com. And remember, if you are alive listening to this broadcast, there's definitely a reason you're alive, even if you haven't discovered it yet. And as you embrace your soul purpose, you begin to heal yourself naturally. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.